Most of us know the Ten Commandments, and many, if not all, can memorize them. Right? But which do you think of the Ten Commandments have we all violated as early as perhaps 1 year old or 2 years old? Which of those 10 do you think?
Having false gods, I think we are not yet capable of doing that. Worshipping graven image. 1 year old, 1 year old, or even younger. Imagine that. Caleb is 2 or 3 years old? 3 years old. Even younger than Caleb. Okay. All right. Not keeping the Sabbath. Well, we're not capable of doing that unless our parents influence us to do that. We're dependent on them. Murdering, definitely not. Stealing, lying. We cannot even speak at 1 year old. All right. Some babies cannot speak at 1 year old. But there's one commandment, brethren, that all of us have committed as early as 1 or 2 years old. And that is the 10th commandment. The 10th commandment. What is the 10th commandment, brethren? It's the commandment against coveting. Thou shalt not covet. And so this afternoon, brethren, I'd like us to study this particular commandment and talk about this in details and the application and the principles that we need to understand about the sin of covetousness. The title of my message today is Beware of the Sin of Covetousness. Let's understand this word, covet. Let's look at the definitions available to us. Dictionary definition, Merriam-Webster. Define covet as to wish for earnestly or enviously. To wish for something enviously, out of jealousy. To desire what belongs to another inordinately or extremely. When we desire something that is not ours, that's coveting. To feel inordinate desire for what belongs to another person. So, Webster definition gives a very negative definition of the word covet. And indeed, it's a negative word. It's a negative word, brother. That's why God warns us against covetousness. However, in the Hebrew word for translated as covet in the English translations of the Bible, the original Hebrew for covet here is chamad. Chamad. C-H-A-M-A-D. And it covers a variety of definitions or meanings. Chamad includes desire. It also means to be desired. It means pleasant. It means to take pleasure. It means beauty, precious. So it covers a variety of usage, and it's not all negative. It's not all negative, brethren. Chamad is not always negative in meaning. It has also some positive applications. So, brethren, since covet is always negative in English, but chamad is sometimes positive, I think we will select the definition here of chamad that would best suit the word, what God really means here in Exodus 20. So, we'd select the word desire here because desire is both positive or negative. Okay? We have positive desires, good desires. We also have negative desires. And so if we replace covet with desire, Exodus 20:17 will read this way. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 17. Chamad also means desire, by the way. So it says in verse 17, you shall not desire your neighbor's house. You shall not desire your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, female servant, nor his ox, his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. So the word desire here, the word chamad here, could be positive, it could be negative. It could be both good or bad, depending on how we use it. And actually, when we desire something, it's not really negative. All right? When we desire to have a wife, there's nothing wrong with that. When we desire something, that we want to have, there's nothing wrong with that. All right? But here, God is telling us is, where is the focus of our desire? Who's the owner of the thing that we desire? Is it something that belongs to somebody or not, brethren? Coveting is a way of get. It's a way of get. And this is opposed to the way of give. And we know the way of give belongs to God. The way of get is Satan's way. And the whole world lies under the sway of the devil. The whole world is influenced by the spirit of covetousness. And you and me, brethren, whether we are aware of it or not, are influenced by this spirit. And so God is commanding us to stay away from the influence of Satan. And that's why he has put the 10 Commandments there. If you look at the 10 Commandments, sometimes we overlook the 10th. All right? We put much emphasis on idols and putting God's name in vain, and the Sabbath, and stealing, and obeying God's commandments, not telling a lie, obeying the parents, I should say, not committing adultery. But the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet. Okay, we read it, but do we really understand what it is and what really God intends of why He actually commanded it to us and included it in the 10 commandments? Christ said, he who violates the least of the commandments, he will be the least in the kingdom. Okay? So if we consider the 10 commandments as the least and we ignore it, or we don't fully understand it, then that might affect our position in the kingdom as well. I mentioned that as early as 1 or even younger or 2 years old, we have committed this sin. Probably innocently. Okay? Why innocently? Well, this is Satan's world. And once we are born, we're exposed to the influences of Satan. And it seems that Satan's way of life automatically enters our system in such a way that even as a child, we are affected by this kind of mindset. We have all observed a child. Okay? Kitang tanan mga kaigsunan, nakita nato ang mga bata. You give a toy to a child, all right? He or she is happy about it. And then once he sees another child having another toy, even if his toy is better, that, the child will desire the toy of another person or another child. That is actually an early manifestation of coveting. As mentioned earlier, a small child is not capable really of violating all the other 9 commandments unless influenced by the adults. But the 10th commandment seems to be automatic. It seems to be in the system of the child. And one of the things that we need to watch out for is the reaction of the child. If he doesn't get what he or she wants, we know the reaction of children, okay? And we need to be able to watch out for this. Children would usually cry, all right, when they don't get what they want. They would scream, they would shout, they would rebel, okay? And in worst cases, they would hit the adult. Why? They didn't get what they want. They didn't get what they want, rather. And the sad thing is, how does the world view that? Now, what's the modern way of viewing that? Well, people say, that's normal. That's natural. Leave them alone. Let them be who they are. And give them what they want so that they will not react that way. That's normal. And so the child will grow up to be even more covetous. And that's the worst thing, brethren. I've done gardening in my house in Leyte, and Meryl helped me in that as well. We've noticed that weeds just grow uh, even when you didn't want it to grow. And you try to uproot the weeds. After 2 days, the shoots will begin to show again. It's there. And it's so stubborn that even if you take the root out after a few days, it begins to appear again. Covetousness is just like that. It starts early, all right? And unless you consistently uproot that, it will develop into a full-grown, selfish attitude and character known as covetousness. So we need to be able to recognize those signs and correct them as early as possible. It's not normal, all right? That is not God's way. That is Satan's way of get. And as people of God, we need to correct that, especially for those people that are under our control. We are, we are stewards of our children as well, and so we need to properly teach the way of God to them as well. All right. In the book of Paul, in the letter of Paul to the Ephesians, he mentioned something like this. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, brethren. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 1. Paul said, "And you he made alive, who were dead in trespasses and sins, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air." Before we were called by God, even right after we were born, foolishness is in the heart of a child, okay, because of Satan's influence. The Spirit, notice this, the Spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience. It works even in the children, in the young generation, in the young children, boys and girls. This spirit, the evil spirit, works on humanity, even on the youngest, among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lusts of the flesh. Notice that word, lusts of the flesh. Lust means desires, selfish desires, and that's covetousness. The lust of the flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath. Now, the word children is emphasized many times here, just as the others. Just as the others. So, the Bible recognizes the spirit that is against God's way. And this spirit is the one dominating the world that we live in today and affects God's people, and attacks and influences the youngest among us. And so we have the responsibility to obey the 10th commandment and to also influence our children to obey. Brethren, it's interesting that, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they were created by God. They both sinned against God. But when Satan tempted Eve, we read that passage here in Genesis chapter 3. There's an interesting word here that was used. Genesis chapter 3 in verse 6. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6. When the woman, referring to Eve, saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise. Now, the word desirable there is chamad. Okay? Chamad. She took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Eve was influenced and motivated by covetousness. All right? And that's the reason why she sinned, and her husband also. Well, there was nothing wrong about desiring to be wise. Okay? There's nothing wrong about being more knowledgeable and knowing more of God's ways. The problem here is Eve was desiring chamad on something that God has forbidden. If we desire on something that God has forbidden, that is covetousness. That is covetousness. Something that belongs to other people is not ours. And desiring to acquire those things that don't belong to us is covetousness, and it's against God's way. In this particular instance, Eve made a decision to replace God's way of thinking with her own way of thinking. All right. He kind of rejected God's way and said, I'm going to decide on my own. All right. And I'm going to leave God's instructions behind. I know better. When we do that, brethren, we're actually replacing God. We're actually replacing God in our life. We're coveting on something, and we're replacing God in our life. And it's interesting how Apostle Paul connected the two principles together. When we replace God with something else and coveting, there's a connection there. Let's go to Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3, beginning in verse 5. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5, it says here, therefore, put to death or mortify your members which are on the earth. What are these members which are on the earth? Fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire. Notice this. And covetousness, which is idolatry. Covetousness and idolatry are connected to each other. And so when we covet on something, we replace God's way with our way. We replace the way of give with the way of get. So that's tantamount to having another God. And that's what Paul said here, that it's equivalent to idolatry. And that's the same offense that Eve committed in the Garden of Eden. And many of us have committed that as well, if not all of us. Verse 6, because of these things the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience, in which you yourselves once walked when you lived in them. We covet, we oppose God's ways. And we accept our own selfish desire. This God-opposing mindset is called idolatry. It's called idolatry. And we have to be aware, and we need to beware of this attitude, brethren. Now let's go into a deeper understanding of covetousness. We basically just introduced the principle. Deeper understanding of covetousness. Commandment number 10 talks about not coveting your neighbor's house. All right. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. Again, the desire to build a house is not wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. That's absolutely okay. In fact, the Bible encourages us to build a house. In the millennial kingdom, the Bible shows that the people there, the subjects there, will be building their own houses. Now, let's go to that passage here in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 65. Isaiah chapter 65, beginning of verse 21. It says, and they shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat the fruit of them. Okay? The Bible shows that it's perfectly okay to build houses, to acquire properties. In the millennial kingdom, it will be done as well. But the problem is when we desire to build something because of jealousy, all right, because of envy, and is motivated by competition. That is what makes it wrong and sinful. And that is now covetousness. There's an example in the scripture of somebody who desired to have a property, or a property in this case. An example of covetousness. Let's go to 1 Kings, brethren. 1 Kings. This is the story of Ahab. King Ahab, beginning in verse 1, it says, 1 Kings 21, I should say. 1 Kings 21, beginning in verse 1. 1 Kings 21, in verse 1. It says, "And it came to pass after these things that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard which was in Jezreel, next to the palace of Ahab king of Samaria. So Ahab spoke to Naboth, saying, Give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is near next to my house. And for it I will give you a vineyard better than it, or it seems good to you, I will give you its worth in money." So Ahab said, "I'm going to buy that property of yours because it's very close to my heart, to my house." Verse 3, "But Naboth said to Ahab, The Lord forbid that I should give the inheritance of my fathers to you. This is an inheritance, I cannot give this to you." So Ahab went into his own house, sullen and displeased because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him. For he had said, "I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers." Then he lay down on his bed and turned away his face and would not eat food. You see that feeling of Ahab here. He's very desirous to have that property. The problem is the property does not belong to him. It doesn't belong to him. And his wife, continue reading in verse 5, Jezebel, his wife, came to him and said to him, "Why is your spirit so sullen that you eat no food?" And if you read the whole story, Jezebel influenced Ahab to kill Naboth. And Ahab took the property that belongs to Naboth. That is an example of coveting our neighbor's house or property. But in our application, that could also mean being jealous about other people's house and wanting to have the same, if not even better than what they have. That is something that we need to be beware of. So if we want to ask if we want to build our house, there's nothing wrong with that. But we need to ask ourselves, why? Why am I building this house? What's my motivation? Am I jealous? What's my attitude towards it? Am I trying to compete with him? Am I trying to show off, okay, that I'm richer than anybody else? All right. So the motivation, the attitude, the focus of why we do certain things is what God is looking at here. Wrong desire to build a house. Now, going back to Exodus 20:17, it also talks about not coveting your neighbor's wife. Not coveting your neighbor's wife. As I mentioned in the introduction, there's nothing wrong desiring to have a wife or a husband. There's nothing wrong with that. The Bible upholds it. All right. In fact, God said it's not good for a man to be alone, and He actually created the woman that Adam needs as a helpmeet, and it became Eve. And even now in our time, brethren, at a certain age, there's a desire for us to look for a spouse, and there's nothing wrong with that. The Bible approves that, and the Bible upholds that. Now, desiring someone else's spouse is covetousness. Okay? It's covetousness, brethren. And, this principle also applies when we desire to have a wife and that person doesn't want to get married to us. It's like we're forcing ourselves to him. All right? That principle applies because the motivation there is selfishness. All right? We want our happiness, but the other person really doesn't like it. And so some people go to the extent of tricking the other person just so he or she will get married to that person. In other cultures, there's this arranged marriage. And against the will of the other person, they don't want to get married, but they don't have any choice. That if given their own free will, they will not really make that decision. Now, forcing ourselves on somebody and getting married with somebody who doesn't want to get married to us is actually selfishness. And that's covetousness. That's covetousness, brethren. So that principle applies to that as well. The next one here that mentions about Exodus 20:17 mentions about coveting the manservant, male servant. It's not applicable to us now anymore. It's coveting the animals, the ox. But in our modern day application, that also could mean coveting the cars and the vehicles of our neighbors, the properties of our neighbors or other people. Any property that belongs to another person should not be coveted after and desired selfishly by us. Vehicles, clothes, houses, even jobs, money. Okay, we should not covet them. And this principle also applies to the things that we cannot afford. The things that we cannot afford. But we still manage to buy or to acquire. How do we manage to acquire something we cannot afford? Utang. Utang. Debt. All right? Of course, brethren, in some situations, getting a debt is okay. Like, for example, emergency medical situations. We certainly need to have debts. Sometimes we go into debt to be able to prioritize life over death. And in other situations as well, such as having does anyone here have credit cards? Credit cards, as long as we pay it every month, no problem, all right? If we can afford to pay it back, no problem. But there are people who go to the extremes that because of their selfish desire, they get something they cannot afford and they have trouble paying it back. And they go to the government and ask for help to wipe out their debts. And they go to other people and bother them, all right, to help them wipe out their debts. Why did they go into that problem? It's because of their selfish desire. That's covetousness, brethren. The things that we desire that are acceptable to God are fine. But when that thing is something we cannot afford and still we go into debt to get it, brethren. And the motivation is just to have it, just to show off, just to, to be in a higher social status or position when people look at us. That is covetousness. So we need to be careful about that as well. Greed, selfishness, covetousness, they are synonymous, by the way. They're connected to each other. Greed, selfishness, covetousness. Our greed for money is what motivates us to desire for more. We desire for more. It's a very common news nowadays in our local news. The Ponzi scheme, right? Investment scams. Okay, and certain person has asked me about that, and I've given them the answer. What the church thinks about that, brethren. Ponzi scheme. What's a Ponzi scheme, by the way? All right, it's a kind of investment strategy that promises high return in just a short period of time. High return in just a short period of time. Now, this kind of scheme or strategies capitalize on human nature. And what is that human nature? Greed. Greed for money. And it's very easy even for righteous man, all right, to fall into this temptation. And so that's why we have to be very careful about these things. How do we know if a certain investment is wrong, is not good? How do we know, brethren? Well, there are signs that we need to watch out for. Ponzi schemes, usually one sign is they offer high return in a short period of time. Okay, that's a scam. When you see something offering that kind of promise, brethren, making that kind of promise, that is a scam. And to be honest, I've been a victim of that before. Yeah. And good thing that the money was returned to me. Okay, good thing. But I learned the lesson, and people think of ways to improve on that particular strategy to try to attract more people. And now there's a different strategy circulating in our country, and many are victims of it already. Now, we need to be careful about that because even the people of God could sometimes be victims of that. Because it's in our human nature to desire for more. It's in our human nature to desire for more. So, one side is it offers high return in a short period of time and make those promises. Another side is they will show you some proofs of payouts, all right, pictures of money, or testimonials of people who were able to get their share. Okay, that is already a red flag. And the third is when they are actually not able to fulfill their promise. Okay, and they delay. And worst is they cannot give the payout anymore. That kind of scheme is not designed to last for a long time. It can only pay out at a certain time, but once it gets bigger and bigger, it will not have the capacity to be able to return the investments of the members. So we call them get rich quickly schemes. Get rich quickly schemes. And the Bible warns us against that. Let's go to the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 28. Proverbs chapter 28, verse 20. Proverbs chapter 28, here in verse 20, it says, a faithful man shall abound with blessings, but he that makes haste to be rich shall not be innocent. He that makes haste to be rich shall not be innocent. So there's a consequence if we invest in these kinds of schemes, brethren. We will lose our money. The sad thing is those money are actually loaned from banks or pawned, or we pawn some property just to be able to invest. We will suffer, all right? And why? Because of our greed for money. Acquiring wealth is not wrong, but honest wealth, brethren, is acquired over a period of time with hard work and diligence. We've heard the sermonette on lessons we can get from the ants. All right, that's one good example we could learn from. Here in the book of Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 13, we could find another writing here of King Solomon, Proverbs chapter 13, verse 11. Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 11 says, there's nothing wrong with investing, by the way. The Bible approves it, but we need to know what are we investing in, and is it a scam or is it legal? Proverbs 13 verse 11 says, wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished, but he that gathers by labor shall increase. Wealth gathered in honest ways, by diligence, by hard work, that is the one that will be blessed by God. Get rich quickly schemes will not last very long. And the person who invests in that, brethren, would suffer sooner or later. But those that are acquired in an honest way, according to God's standards, that is the one that will be blessed. Ecclesiastes 11, verse 2. Ecclesiastes chapter 11 and verse 2. Again, this is King Solomon. Ecclesiastes chapter 11 and verse 2 says, Give a portion to 7 and also to 8, for you know not what evil shall be upon the earth. It's interesting how the NIV renders it. The NIV says, invest on 7 or on 8, because you don't know what the future holds. All right. This is actually referring to distributing your investments, not just in one investment, but in more than one. Because things are unpredictable. Even the stock market is unpredictable. If one fails, at least there's another one that will give you the return. And it's a wise advice from King Solomon, which shows to us that there's nothing wrong with investing. The Bible approves it. But because of our selfish desire and greed for money, we become prey to those Ponzi schemes, and that is a proof of covetousness. And we need to be aware of that and beware of those things as well. Luke 16. Let's go to Luke chapter 16. What does Christ have to say about greed for money? Luke chapter 16. I mentioned that even the most converted or righteous will be influenced or tempted to pursue these things. Luke chapter 16 and verse 13. Christ said, Luke 16:13, no servants can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. You cannot serve God and money. Mammon here means wealth or money. We either love one and hate the other, or vice versa. Okay. Brethren, money in Timothy, the book of Timothy, is the love of money. Okay, the love of money is the root of all evil. Now, the word love there is not agape. Okay, it's not the agape of money. It's actually the filio of money. It's the desire of money. And that desire, when it is not according to God's ways, is called covetousness. The covetousness of money, when we covet money, brethren, that will be the root of all evil. People will resort to stealing. People will resort to tricking other people. People will resort to taking advantage of other people. It's the root of all evil, brethren. Now, continue reading verse 14 of Luke 16. Interesting thing here, verse 14. Now the Pharisees who were lovers of money also heard all these things, and they derided him. Lovers of money, covetous Pharisees, religious leaders. How did they react, brethren? They derided Christ for saying that. What did deride means? It means to mock and to ridicule Christ for saying that. And sometimes we can fall prey on the love of money and the greediness of the spirit of greediness that Satan influences us. And we need to be careful about that as well. Apostle Paul has some examples for us to follow, and he also has some advice. And I like to mention the final 3 verses here for us to remember. Here's an example of Apostle Paul. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 5. Paul said, begin reading in verse 4. Verse 4. But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, even so we speak. Okay, we're doing our job. We're doing what we are called to do, Paul said. Not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts. Verse 5. For neither at any time did we use flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak for covetousness. God is a witness. Paul was preaching the gospel not motivated with covetousness. He's not motivated with covetousness. Sadly, the world religious leaders today are using religion to earn money and to get more money. Paul's example is the contrary. He was not motivated with covetousness. He was doing it to please God, not to please other people, not even to please himself. In fact, he had a lot of inconveniences and discomfort while doing the work of God, even to the point of walking in the valley of death, shadow of valley of death, brethren. He's been through those things. He forgot about his comfort. He forgot about conveniences. He was just doing it to please God, not because of money. What a good example for us to follow. Good example for us to follow. If we're doing something and if we're sacrificing and doing God's work and not get any recognition out of it, well, that's good, because God is your ultimate rewarder. God will reward you. And we need to watch out for our attitude and motivations in doing God's work. Here in Ephesians 5, Ephesians chapter 5, second to the last verse, brethren. Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5 in verse 3. Let's start with verse 1. It says, "Be ye therefore followers of God as dear children, and walk in love as Christ has also has loved us, and has given himself for us as an offering and sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling savor," or aroma. Verse 3. "But fornication and all uncleanness," or, notice the word "or" there, covetousness. When we desire for someone selfishly, that's fornication. Okay? When we desire in our mind things that does not belong to us, that's uncleanness. All right? That's not according to God's ways. Now, it's all equated to covetousness. Fornication, uncleanness, or covetousness. Let it not be once named among you as becomes saints. We're the saints of God. We're called to be righteous people. Covetousness should not be part of our life and of our character. Verse 4, "Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather giving of thanks." Paul wants us to get rid of covetousness in all its form and shape. And we also have the responsibility to remove this character and to stop this character from developing in our children as early as 1 year old. Okay? That's our responsibility, brethren. Let it not be named among us. So covetousness is a serious thing. In fact, that's one of the 10 Commandments. God thinks of it seriously. And when we offend God in that area, we face serious consequences and repercussions. And so we need to put weight on this 10th commandment. It's the last of the 10, but definitely not the least. It's not the least among the 10 commandments. And we need to carefully watch ourselves and beware that we don't commit this sin. And so we go to the final question. What's the antidote for covetousness? What's the antidote? Kasi panlaban, ani, if this is a poison, what's the antivenom for this? What's the antivenom? This will be our last verse, brethren. And it's found in Hebrews chapter 13. Hebrews chapter 13. Hebrews chapter 13. And verse 5. Verse 5 says, "Let your conversation or conduct be without covetousness." Beware of it. It should not be part of you. So how do we avoid it? Continue reading. "And be content. Be content with such things as you have. For he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Sometimes because of our discontent, we desire higher salary, we desire, a spouse, all right? We desire properties, we desire a car. As I said, nothing wrong with that, but because of discontent and selfish desires, it becomes covetousness. And the antidote to that is be content. Be content with what you have right now. As long as you're doing your best, all right, to work 6 days a week and to rest on the Sabbath. By the way, working 6 days a week is part of this fourth commandment. If you don't work 6 days a week, that's a violation of the fourth commandment. Because the fourth commandment says, remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. In 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. And if you will not labor in 6 days, then you're not keeping the fourth commandment. All right? So if we work diligently, brethren, for 6 days, then you are keeping the commandments. Of course, this is a different case with retired people. All right? They already have exhausted all their years to work. All right? And they are now reaping the rewards for their hard labor. But this is referring to people in general. Okay? We are commanded to work for 6 days and rest on the Sabbath. As long as we are doing what we are expected to do by God, we have to be content. Because God is blessing us. All right? In fact, the phrase here, He will never leave us. All right? Nor forsake us. We have this amount of salary, be content. We have this property, or we don't have this property, be content. There is a purpose why you have that and why you don't have that. All right? Be content with the things that we have. Contentment is the antidote to covetousness. And of course, we have to be very thankful for the things that we currently have, because God is the source of all the blessings in our life. And the more we are thankful, the more that we appreciate the things that God has given us. And so, brethren, I hope that this lesson, this message will give us invaluable lessons that we can apply. We have to beware of the violation of the 10th commandment. We easily try to forget it. All right, not try to forget, but we can easily forget it. But actually, it's a very, very important thing to remember and be aware of. So I hope that all of us will not be guilty of violating this commandment, and we will all be content in God's eyes, and God will bless us ultimately when we do that. Happy Sabbath to all of you.